6:26 in the morning. Two airport security officers step onto a plane that hasn't left the gate. They're not here for a bomb. They're here for a man in a 58-year-old body wearing a Navy suit, sitting perfectly still in seat 1A. His hands rest on his knees. His boarding pass is valid. His ID has been checked twice. He hasn't raised his voice once. Behind them, a flight attendant is saying a sentence she will spend the rest of her life trying to explain. He doesn't belong. The captain hesitates. 23 years of flying, and something in his chest is quietly beginning to come loose. In row 3, a woman lifts her phone. She's not filming for the internet. She's filming because she heard those words once before through a telephone, 3 years ago. In her father's voice, the man in 1A checks his watch. It belonged to his father. Then he reaches, very slowly, for his briefcase. Atlanta, 5:47 in the morning. The kind of hour that belongs to janitors and insomniacs and people carrying things they can't put down. Gate B7 was half empty. The overhead lights buzzed with that particular fluorescent indifference that airports specialize in. A cleaning crew pushed Eckhart past the windows. Outside, the tarmac was still dark. The planes sat like sleeping animals, patient and enormous, waiting for the sun to decide what to do. James Caldwell sat alone. Not the way people usually sit alone in airports. Not hunched over a phone, earbuds in, building a wall of noise between themselves and the world. James sat the way a man sits when he has genuinely decided to be still. Back straight, hands loose on his knees, a paper cup of black coffee cooling on the seat beside him. 58 years old, navy suit, pressed but not new. The kind of suit that had been to funerals and negotiations and Sunday dinners and still looked like it belonged at all of them. The jacket carried that particular quality of fabric that has been lived in for years, not worn out, just known in the watch. A simple face, the kind of watch that didn't try to tell you anything except the time. The crystal was scratched in 3 places. James had never replaced it. He wasn't going to. It had been his father's. He wasn't reading, wasn't listening to anything. Just watching some planes through the window and thinking about his father. Or maybe not thinking exactly. More like carrying him. The way you carry someone who is gone. Not in your hands. Somewhere deeper. Somewhere without a clean name. The memory arrived the way it always did. Uninvited. Unhurried. Completely sure of itself. James, 30 years old, a different suit, cheaper. Standing outside a government building in Washington, D.C. The steps were wide and gray and worn smooth by decades of feet that had climbed them before his. He stood at the bottom and looked up at the entrance, briefcase in one hand, the letter of appointment in the other. He remembered the exact weight of that moment, the way the morning air tasted, the way he had breathed in slowly, the way his father had taught him, fill the whole chest. Not just the top, and then walked up the steps without looking back. He never looked back. That was the first time he had shown up somewhere that was not entirely ready for him. It was not the last. The gate agent's voice cut through the terminal. Transamerica Flight 1147 to Phoenix. Now boarding first class and premium cabin passengers. James picked up his briefcase, left the cold coffee where it was, stood slowly, not because his body required it. Because he had learned over many years that there was no reason to rush toward things that were already waiting. He handed his boarding pass to the gate agent. She scanned it without looking at him. He walked down the jetway, found his seat, 1A, window, left side. He settled in, placed the briefcase under the seat in front of him, loosened his tie 1/4 of an inch, no more, looked out the window at the dark tarmac and the sleeping planes and the first pale suggestion of light beginning at the horizon's edge. He closed his eyes, not sleeping, just resting inside himself for a moment before the day started up again. Because the day was going to start up. He knew that. He had planned for it. In the briefcase under the seat in front of him, 14 months of work, 26 flights, 61 documented incidents, names, dates, flight numbers, the kind of details that when you read them one after another, stopped feeling like separate events and started feeling like a single long sentence that nobody had been willing to finish. A pattern, which is just another word for something that keeps happening because nothing has stopped it yet. He let his eyes stay closed. Let the sounds of the cabin fill up around him. Overhead bins closing, the rustle of people settling, the low conversation of passengers who knew each other, and the deliberate silence of those who didn't. He was ready. He had been ready for a long time. She appeared the way trouble usually does. Quietly, professionally, with a smile that was technically present, but calibrated to a temperature just below warmth. Carol Beaumont, 41 years old, 12 years with Transamerica Airlines. Hair pulled back neat, uniform pressed sharp. The kind of woman who arrived early and knew every policy in the manual and could cite the page number without pausing to think. She came through the forward cabin door, and her eyes moved the way flight attendant eyes always move, sweeping, cataloging, assessing. It was efficient and practiced and mostly unconscious, the way any Aboriginal skill eventually becomes. And then her eyes landed on seat 1A on James. She stopped, not for long, half a second, maybe a fraction less. But James had spent 14 months learning to notice half seconds. He kept his eyes closed. He already knew she was there. He could hear the exact place where her footsteps had stopped. A small adjustment in her breathing. He waited, her footsteps, coming closer, stopping beside him. He opened his eyes. She smiling, the smile of someone who had decided on an approach and was executing it. Not cold, not warm, precisely calibrated to convey professionalism without committing to anything beyond it. May I see your boarding pass? James looked at her for a moment, one full second. Kind of look that simply observes without judgment and therefore somehow communicates everything. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and handed it to her. Said nothing. She took it, looked at him, looked at it again. That second look. That was the thing, not the first look. The first look was procedure. The second look was something else entirely. And a photo ID, please. He handed her his license. She studied it. Compared to the boarding pass. Compared both to his face. The whole process took approximately seconds longer than it needed to. She handed both back. Thank you. Turned go. Stop. Turned back. Sir, I just want to confirm this is a full fare first class ticket. Yes. Purchased this morning. At 6:43 a.m. Online. Her smile stayed exactly where it was. Fixed. Unmoved. Not reaching anything above the level of her mouth. I'll need to verify these surrogates routine check. James looked at her steadily, the kind of steadiness that is not aggression and is not submission. Just presence, the simple, unmoving fact of a person who knows exactly where he is and why. Has anyone else in first class been asked for a routine check this morning? The smile flickered, just once, just slightly. I'll be right back, sir. She turned and walked toward the galley. James watched her go, then he turned back to the window. Outside, the sky was beginning to make up its mind about the day. The first, real filter showing at the horizon. Orange below, softening to gray above. He thought, here we go. Not with anger, not even with surprise. Just with the particular weight of recognition. The feeling of arriving at a place you have been before without choosing to return. It just came, like weather, like it always did. Because that was the other thing about patterns. They didn't announce themselves. They simply repeated, and kept repeating, until somebody decided to write them down. I had been writing them down for 14 months. The pen was, so to speak, still in his hand. Maya Reeves was sitting in 3C, 30 years old. Natural hair pinned up with 2 clips and the focused energy of someone who had made a red-eye connection work through sheer determination. She worked in patient advocacy at a hospital in Phoenix. She was going home after a 3-day conference in Atlanta that had run longer than planned. She was tired. She had a book in her bag she hadn't opened, and a window seat she hadn't gotten, and 17 unread messages she was pretending didn't exist. She had not planned to pay attention to anything happening in first class. But she heard it. Because the galley curtain was open and Carol Beaumont's voice when she reached the colleague standing near the front was not as quiet as Carol Beaumont probably believed it to be. 3 words, clean, certain, FUD in the tone of a professional sharing a professional assessment. He doesn't belong. Maya's hand went still on the armrest. She didn't reach for her phone. Not yet. She just went very still the way people go still when they hear something that is both completely new and somehow already familiar. The way you recognize a sound you've only heard once before but can never unhear. Because she had heard those words before. Not in an airport. Through a phone 3 years ago. Her father's voice at the other end. Carefully neutral in that specific way his voice got when he was working very hard not to let something show. She sat still. She listened. Captain Douglas Merritt came out of the cockpit at 6:19 in the morning. 55 years old. Broad through the shoulders. Silver at the temples. 23 years of flying had given him a particular way of moving through a cabin. Unhurried, grounded, The walk of a man who understood weight distribution in more ways than the aeronautical. I'd been a good captain. He knew that without arrogance. He showed up. He made the right calls. He went home to his wife and his son, and his house in Scottsdale, and he slept soundly because he had earned that sleep. He did not think of himself as a man who made assumptions. He thought of himself as a man who reads situations quickly, accurately, professionally. These are not always the same thing. Ha found Carol near the forward galley. She spoke quietly and quickly, and he listened with the focused attention of someone accustomed to receiving information under time pressure and acting on it. His eyes moved toward seat 1A. He saw James Caldwell. He processed what he saw in 3 seconds. Expensive suit, briefcase, calm posture, hands resting on his knees. No visible distress, no visible aggression. Nothing that matched what the words disruptive passenger typically brought to his mental picture. Then he processed what Carol was telling him. Same-day full fare ticket. Refused additional verification. Aggressive. Something about the way the passenger was watching the time. Barrett looked at James again. The man had not moved, was looking out the window, possibly aggressive. He walked forward. "Good morning, sir. I'm Captain Merritt." James looked up. "Good morning, Captain. I understand there's been some confusion about your seat assignment." "There hasn't been any confusion on my end." Merritt paused. The response was too precise, too clean. The response of someone who had been in this conversation before and had decided exactly how much ground he was willing to give. "We have a procedure for same-day full-fare purchases in premium." Captain Merritt. Not loud, not sharp. Just landing. The way a period lands at the end of a sentence that does not intend to continue into another clause. In the last 20 minutes, how many passengers in this cabin have been asked to verify their tickets? Todd opened his saw, closed it. "I'm asking," James said, "because I'd like to understand whether this is a procedure or a pattern. Those are two different things, and they have two different implications." Something shifted in the air. Small, almost imperceptible, but Merritt felt it. The feeling of a conversation changing direction in a way you hadn't anticipated and couldn't quite account for. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me to the gate area to resolve this." No, one word. The same tone, not threatening, not performative, just a wall that had always been there, stating the obvious fact of its own existence. "I'm not moving, Captain. Not because I'm being difficult, but because this is my seat. I paid for this seat. I have every right to sit in it, and I have no obligation to explain myself because of the way I look." Merritt stood very still, because the thing was, the man wasn't wrong. Merritt knew that even as he stood there holding his professional authority around himself like a jacket, he knew it in the part of his brain that preceded training, the part that simply processed what was in front of him. But Carol was 3 feet away, 12 years. Never wrong about a passenger before, never. He made the call. "I'm going to need to contact ground security." James nodded slowly, not resigned but defeated, the nod of someone who had factored this in. "I thought you might. Go ahead." Carol stepped forward. Her voice had risen slightly. The specific pitch of someone who is frightened and is covering it with certainty. "He's been timing us. On his watch. He keeps checking it. He's been planning Ems Beaumont." She stopped. Jamesy looked at her, direct, not cruel, just absolutely, unequivocally clear. "I've looked at my watch twice since boarding, once when I sat down. Once when you asked me a third time to verify documentation you'd already verified. That's not planning. That's waiting." The cabin was quiet in a way it hadn't been before. Not the ordinary quiet of a pre-departure aircraft. A different kind. The kind where people who have been actively ignoring decide, all at once, that they can no longer afford to. The businessman in 2C had set down his newspaper. The woman in 3A had angled her phone without appearing to angle it. And Maya Reeves in 3C had pressed record. Not for an audience. Not for anything except the simple fact that the recording would mean it had happened. Would mean it could not be revised later by anyone's selective memory. She had learned the value of that from her father. From what the absence of a recording had cost him. She kept the phone low. She kept her face neutral. She recorded. Officer Jerome Tate and Officer Sandra Drummond boarded the aircraft at 6:26 in the morning. Tate was broad, efficient, the kind of person whose physical presence communicated competence before he said a word. Drummond was quieter, more compact, with the focused attention of someone who processed the whole room before settling on any single point within it. They came through the door and read the cabin in the way security officers read spaces. Quick inventory, threat assessment, body language scan. James Caldwell was sitting in seat 1A with his hands resting on his knees. The threat assessment, objectively, 0, but they had reported a passenger and a shaken crew member and a captain who needed this resolved before departure in under 10 minutes. Tate stepped forward. Sir, I'm going to need you to come with us. The crew has reported. What specifically has been reported? What action have I taken? Tate paused. Because the man was right, technically, which was not nothing. Sir, I have been sitting here, quietly. The valid boarding pass and valid photo identification that has been reviewed twice. I have not raised my voice. I have not moved from this seat. I have not touched anyone or anything. I have not made any threats. He looked at Tate steadily. What specific grounds? Drummond was watching James with the expression of someone who has just revised a calculation mid-process. Not sympathy exactly, something more professional than that. The expression of a person whose job is to assess situations accurately, and who was now reassessing. Carol moved forward. Her voice had gone high and thin. He's been threatening us this whole time. He keeps timing everything. He said there would be consequences. Beaumont. She stopped again. The second time James had stopped her with 2 words and a tone that carried no heat whatsoever, which somehow made it more effective, not less. I said that if you proceeded with removing me, there would be consequences. That is not a threat. That is an accurate description of the legal landscape. He looked at Tate. Then Drummond. Are you both familiar with 49 CFR Part 382, the Air Carrier Access Act? Neither of them answered, which was itself an answer. Then I'd suggest, James said, before anyone proceeds with anything, someone makes a phone call. He reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, with the deliberate transparency of a man who had learned, young, in a way that never stopped costing him something, to make every gesture completely legible, to never, under any circumstances, be the source of ambiguity. He pulled out a business card, plain, white, simple to Tate. Tate took it, read it. His face rearranged itself in the way faces do when information arrives that doesn't fit the existing picture. Not dramatic, just a small, irrevocable shift. I handed it to Drummond. She read it, looked at James, read it again. Sir, Tate said. His voice had changed. Something had vacated it. Not authority exactly, more like certainty. Would you mind if I make the call? James said. I'd prefer it. Merritt's radio crackled at 6:31 in the morning. He stepped back from the forward cabin, pressed the device to his ear. The voice on the other end was not the ground crew coordinator he expected. Margaret Osei, Senior Vice President of Operations. A voice Merritt had heard exactly twice in 23 years. Once at a company-wide all-hands meeting and once on a pre-recorded compliance training video. The voice of someone who existed, in his professional world, approximately 3 atmospheric levels above him. Captain Merritt, this is SVP Osei. I need you to listen to me carefully. He stood very still. Do not remove the passenger in seat 1A. Do not allow security to proceed with any removal or detainment. Stand down immediately and await executive-level instruction. Do you copy? The radio felt different in his hand, heavier, or maybe it was his hand that felt different. I copy, he said. Good. The line went quiet. A Merritt stood in the narrow space between the galley and the forward cabin for a moment. He could see James from where he stood. The man hadn't moved, hands on his knees, looking out the window, watching the sky lighten over the tarmac with the patience of someone who already knew what the day held and had made his peace with it, like he had known exactly what was coming. Like he had not just endured this, like he had chosen it, walked into it deliberately, with a plan. A Merritt walked back into the forward cabin. His footsteps were different. Something had shifted in his chest, not dramatically, not like a rupture, more like a door that had been closed for a very long time had moved on its hinge. Just slightly, just enough to let something through. He stopped beside seat 1A. James turned from the window and looked at him. They looked at each other for a moment. 2 men in their 50s, both with things they were carrying, both with sons, both with histories that had led them to this specific cabin at this specific hour, in a way neither of them had fully examined before now. Security officers are standing down, Merritt said. James nodded. Once, sir, started, stopped. The sentences he had started didn't have a professional ending. It had a human one, and he hadn't prepared a human one. Sit down, Captain, James said. Not unkind, just clear. Let's do this the right way. Merritt looked at the empty seat across the aisle. He sat down. Outside the window, the sun had finished deciding to rise. The tarmac glowed gold at the edges. The planes were waking up. Somewhere in the terminal, someone was announcing delays to Minneapolis. A child was asking for something that was not available. A man in a different gate was running for a connection he was going to make with 30 seconds to spare. And in Seat 1A of Transamerica Flight 1147, James Caldwell reached down and pulled his briefcase from beneath the seat, placed it on his lap, opened it. Not all the way, just enough. He didn't say anything yet. He let the silence do what silence does when it's been earned, when the room has caught up enough to actually hear what comes next. Then he spoke, quiet, no theater, no performance. Just the plain voice of a man saying the plain truth after a long time of waiting for the right moment to say it. Before we go any further, I need everyone to understand something. He looked at Merritt, at Carol, who had moved to the edge of the galley but had not left, at Officers Tate and Drummond, still present, still recalibrating, at the cabin of passengers who had given up the pretense of doing anything other than listening. I booked this seat 11 days ago. I've been on 26 flights in the past 14 months. Window seats, middle seats, aisle seats. Coach, business, and first class. I've flown through weather delays and maintenance holds and one actual emergency landing in Charlotte that I don't particularly want to repeat. He paused. And in 14 months and 26 flights, I have been asked to verify my ticket after boarding in a premium cabin 9 times. He let that number sit in the air. 9 times out of 11 premium flights. Another pause. Longer, which might not sound significant, until you consider that in those same 11 flights, I watched 23 other first-class passengers board, settle in, and receive a beverage of their choice without being asked to prove they belonged there. He looked at Carol directly, not with anger, with the even clear gaze of a man presenting evidence. 9 out of 11, Ms. Beaumont, and I have every one of those 9 documented. Flight number, date, time. Name of the crew member who initiated the request. What was said? What happened next?
Carol's face had gone through several things since this conversation began.
Right now it was doing something that didn't have a single clean name. The thing that happens when you start to understand, slowly and without wanting to, the full shape of something you have been part of. My name, James said, is James Caldwell. I serve as an independent reviewer for the Office of Civil Rights within the U.S. Department of Transportation. I was appointed 14 months ago to conduct a structured review of discrimination patterns in domestic commercial aviation. He reached into the briefcase, pulled out the folder. Thick, tab, color-coded with the particular organization of someone who had understood from the beginning that the record would matter. That someone would eventually need to read it, that the details were not supplemental, they were the whole point. He placed it on the armrest. Every flight I've taken has been part of that review, including this one. I didn't identify myself at the beginning of this situation, because an independent review requires independent conditions. I needed to see what would happen without my identity changing it. He looked at the cabin, at all of it, at the people and the phones and the morning light coming through the windows and the whole complicated weight of the moment. How I've seen it. The silence that followed was different from every silence before it in that cabin that morning. Earlier silences had been the silence of tension, of people waiting, of a situation gathering momentum. This one was the silence of arrival, of a room that had just understood where it was. Carol stood at the edge of the galley, with her arms loose at her sides, not crossed anymore. Something in her posture had unclenched without her deciding to unclench it. Merritt sat in the aisle seat across from 1A and looked at his hands. He was thinking about his son. He didn't know yet that he was thinking about his son. But he was. Maya Reeves, in 3C, had been recording for 9 minutes and 43 seconds. She looked at her phone. At James. At her phone again. She thought about her father. She kept recording. James turned back to the window. Atlanta below, or what little of it was visible from this angle. The edge of the tarmac, the beginning of the sky. The sun fully up now, the day committed to itself, no longer tentative at the horizon. In the briefcase on his lap, 61 documented incidents. 14 months of showing up. 1 more flight still to land. He was patient. He had been practicing patience for a very long time. The plane pushed back from the gate 37 minutes late. Nobody announced the reason. Nobody needed to. The 147 passengers on Transamerica Flight 1 of N47 had been sitting in a pressurized aluminum watching something unfold in the forward cabin, and they all understood, in various degrees of clarity and discomfort, that the delay belonged to what they had witnessed. Some of them were angry about it. The businessman in 2C checked his watch 4 times in the first 10 minutes of taxi. The couple in 4A spoke in low, urgent tones about a connection in Phoenix. A woman near the back complained loudly enough to reach the galley about professionalism on Tom samples and the general deterioration of air travel since some unspecified golden era. Most of them were quiet in the way people are quiet when they've seen something they're still processing, when the thing they witnessed hasn't yet finished becoming a memory and is still occurring somewhere inside them, rearranging things. James watched the terminal slide past the window as the plane turned onto the taxiway. Atlanta receding. The gate they'd been parked at becoming just another jet bridge among many, indistinguishable, now out from any other. He placed his briefcase on the empty seat beside him. The seat that should have been occupied, would have been occupied, if the aircraft had filled the way the aircraft was supposed to fill. But first class on this particular Tuesday morning flight was running light. 7 passengers out of 12 possible seats, which meant space. Which meant in practical terms that the conversation that was about to happen had room to breathe. He opened the briefcase, this time all the way. Harold Beaumont had returned to the forward galley during taxi. Protocol. Crew members had to be seated for takeoff. She had sat in her jump seat with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes fixed on a point on the opposite wall, and her mind somewhere entirely different. James had watched her without appearing to watch her. He was good at that. 14 months of this work had made him good at a great many things he would have preferred not to need. Merritt had returned to the cockpit. The plane lifted off at 7:23 a.m. Atlanta time. James felt the familiar lurch of wheels leaving tarmac. The brief suspended moment where you are neither on the ground nor in the air, simply committed to the transition. Then the angle of the cabin shifting, Atlanta falling away below. The geometric grid of streets and neighborhoods and highways shrinking into abstraction. He always liked that moment, not the departure exactly, the commitment of it. The point past which reversal was no longer a practical option. He looked at the folder in his briefcase. 61 incidents. He had read them so many times he no longer needed to open the tabs to know what each one said. Flight number, date, time, location, initiating crew member. Nature of interaction, documented language used, outcome. He knew them the way you know songs you've heard 1,000 times, not just the melody. The spaces between the notes. The seatbelt sign chimed off. And almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting for exactly that sound, Carol Beaumont appeared from the galley. She walked toward him. Not the professional walk she'd used this morning, the efficient measured stride of a flight attendant moving through a cabin with purpose. This was something different. Slower, the walk of someone who is going somewhere because they've decided they have to, not because the job requires it. She stopped beside seat 1A. This looked at the empty seat next to him, where the briefcase sat. May I? James moved the briefcase to the floor. She sat down. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Below the window, Atlanta had become cloud. The city gone, replaced by the soft gray-white of cloud cover, and above it the clear sharp blue of altitude. The kind of blue that exists nowhere on the ground. 4, Carol said. James looked at her. You said 4 documented incidents involving me. Yes. She was looking straight ahead, at the seat back in front of her. At nothing, really. At the distance that exists between a person and the thing they are trying to understand about themselves. I remember 2 of them, she said. I didn't remember the other 2 until you said the number. And then they came back. What do you remember about them? She was quiet for a moment. I remember feeling certain each time. I remember that certainty feeling professional, like I was doing my job, reading a situation correctly, acting on experience. And now? She pressed her lips together. Now I'm sitting here trying to figure out what experience actually taught me. Whether the pattern I was reading was real or whether I was. She stopped, started again. Whether I was confirming something I already believed and calling it observation. James said nothing. He let the question live in the air, let her sit with it. Because that was the thing about this particular conversation. You couldn't rush it. You couldn't guide it toward the correct answer. The correct answer had to arrive on its own, through its own process, or it wasn't really an answer. It was just compliance. And compliance and understanding were not in his experience the same thing at all. Clouds broke for a moment below the window. A gap. Green fields visible far below, the scale so small it looked like a child's drawing of a landscape. Then cloud again. My mother was a housekeeper, Carol said. Her voice had changed. Lower. The professional surface of it worn away by the morning, by everything the morning had contained, until what was left was something older and less managed. Her whole life, she cleaned houses for people who had things, nice things, who lived in certain neighborhoods and took certain vacations and flew in certain cabins. She paused. She used to tell me, know who you're dealing with before you let your guard down. Read people fast. Trust your first read. Because the world will not always give you a second chance to correct a mistake. She was trying to protect you, James said. She was giving me what she had, the tools that had kept her safe. Yes, but, she stopped herself, the word hanging there. But some tools, James said, cut the wrong things when you stop examining what you're doing with them. Carol looked at him. For the first time since this morning, she looked at him the way you look at a person rather than a situation. Without assessment, without the professional filter, just seeing him. 58 years old, his father's watch, the briefcase on the floor with 14 months of someone else's pain organized by date. I have a daughter, she said. Sophie, she's 7. James nodded. She has the loudest laugh I've ever heard in my life. She doesn't care where she is or who's around. When something strikes her as funny, she just lets it out. Full volume. No editing. Something in James's face shifted. Small. Real. What do you want her to learn from today? He asked. Carol didn't answer right away. She sat with the question. Which was the right thing to do with it? It was not a question that deserved a fast answer. Fast answers to that question were almost always wrong. Below the window, the clouds had closed completely. There was nothing visible now but blue above and white below, and the faint, thin line where they met. I want her to learn that mistakes don't have to be the last word, Carol said finally. That what you do after is part of the story. Maybe most of the story. James looked at her for a long moment. Then you need to make sure what you do after is actually something. Not just the feeling of having understood, the actual work of changing. She nodded, slowly, the nod of someone receiving something they needed and didn't want simultaneously. The nod of someone who knows the difference between a comfortable understanding and an uncomfortable one, and has just received the latter. I know, she said. And she meant it. James could hear that she meant it, which was not a small thing. In 14 months of this work, he had heard a great many people say they understood. He had learned to hear the difference between the ones who did and the ones who believed they did, which was Beaumont meant it. She stood up, smoothed her uniform. I should get back to the cabin. Yes. She took one step. Stop. Sister Caldwell. He looked up. What you're doing, the 14 months, the flights, the documentations, is stopped. Found a different way in. Is it working? Does any of this actually change anything? James looked at her for a long moment. Ask me in 20 years, he said. She almost smiled. Almost. Then she walked back toward the galley, and James turned back to the window, and below the clouds somewhere Atlanta was already an hour behind them. The tablet chimed at 8:11 in the morning. James accepted the call. The screen filled with 2 faces. A conference room in the airline's headquarters. The long table, the fluorescent light that tried to look natural, the particular atmosphere of people who had been at work since before most people set their alarms. Warren Stahl at one end, CEO of Transamerica Airlines, a man in his late 50s with the look of someone who had received a phone call in the early hours and had not yet fully processed its implications. Margaret Osei beside him, silver earrings, the expression of someone who was already 3 moves ahead and was choosing to let the room catch up at its own pace. James. Her voice came through the tablet speaker, clear and unhurried. We've been monitoring. Are you all right? That was the moment. The word that changed everything in the forward cabin, again, for anyone close enough to hear. She had not said Mr. Caldwell. She had not said Sir. She had said James. First name. No preamble. The tone of someone checking on a colleague they were genuinely worried about. Carol, who had returned to the galley and had not quite fully returned to professional composure, heard it. And something in her face, Not crumbled, not collapsed, rearranged. The way a picture rearranges when you take 3 steps back and suddenly see the whole of it. Oh, her face said. Oh, I'm fine, Margaret, James said. I'd like the crew to hear this conversation. Captain Merritt should come out if he's able. A brief pause, then Osei. Of course. James turned slightly toward the cockpit. Merritt had already emerged. I'd been listening from the doorway, the professional habit of a captain monitoring his cabin even while managing his aircraft. Now he came forward, stood in the aisle beside seat 1A, arms at his sides, not quite knowing what posture this moment called for. Warren, James said to the screen, I'm going to show the crew what's the briefcase before we discuss next steps. I'd like you to hear this too. Stahl nodded. Once, the nod of a man who has made a decision and is now simply proceeding in its direction. James picked up the folder from the floor, opened it. 61 reports, not summaries, not aggregate statistics, actual documented instance, each one its own tab, its own page, its own record of a specific human being in a specific seat on a specific flight being made to feel that they did not belong where they had paid to be. James turned to a section near the middle, tabbed in yellow. He pulled out a single page, set it on the open armrest. Carol Beaumont, he said. Not an accusation, a fact. Facts delivered without embellishment in James Caldwell's particular voice had a weight that accusations rarely achieved because accusations could be argued with. Facts simply sat there, requiring you to account for them. 12 years with Transamerica. Documented incidents involving premium cabin passenger challenges. 4. This morning is the 5th. Carol, standing at the edge of the galley, made a sound. Small, involuntary. The kind of sound that escapes before the person making it has time to decide whether to let it out. 4 incidents, James continued. 4 different passengers. 4 different flights. The documented justifications at the time. Suspicious behavior, documentation irregularities, discretion, failure to comply with crew instruction. He looked at her directly. 4 different justifications. One consistent variable across all 4. She knew what he was going to say. She knew it the way you know something you have spent time not knowing. The knowing was always there, underneath, waiting. The passengers? James said, in all 4 cases, and in this morning's interaction. The passengers were black. The words were in the air now, actually in the air, not implied. A knot circling politely, the edge of the conversation where everyone could see them, but no one was acknowledging them. Stated plainly in a voice that neither rose nor fell. Carol stood with it. She didn't flinch. She didn't object. She stood with it the way you stand with something true that you have been avoiding. James turned to a different tab. Blue this time. Captain Douglas Merritt. 23 years with Transamerica. Authorized passenger removal or relocation from premium cabins on 22 occasions over the review period. Of those 22, 15 involved passengers of color. 2 involved white passengers, both in documented cases of intoxication. The remaining 5 involved passengers of other demographics. Merritt had been standing very still. Now he was standing even stiller. The stillness of a man who has been handed a mirror and a light he was not prepared for. I didn't. He started. I know, James said. Quietly, not dismissively, with the full weight of understanding behind it. Because that was the part that Merritt needed to hear first, not the accusation. The acknowledgement that this was not a thing he had chosen consciously. Had planned, had enacted with deliberate malice, and also that this did not make it smaller. That conscious choice was not the only way harm happened. That pattern and habit and the accumulated weight of assumption could produce the same outcomes as intent without ever requiring it. I know you didn't realize, James said. That is precisely what makes this the kind of problem that requires documentation instead of just conversation. Merritt looked at the page, at his own name in the blue-tabbed section. At the numbers beside it. He looked like a man arriving somewhere he had been traveling toward without knowing it. From the tablet, Warren Stahl spoke. James. Careful. Choosing. Go ahead, Warren. I need to tell you something, and I need to say it in front of the crew. James waited. Stahl looked at something off-screen for a moment, a piece of paper maybe. Or the middles of the things you've been avoiding tend to live. Then back at the camera. I received a preliminary summary from your office. 4 months ago, I read it, all of it. The forward cabin was absolutely silent. I forwarded it to the head of HR with a request for assessment and recommended response. The response came 6 weeks later. A memo recommending expanded diversity and inclusion training the next quarterly cycle, with a target implementation date in Q3. He paused. I approved the memo. I sent a reply saying the approach sounded right. He stopped, started again, and then I moved on to the next thing on my desk. Because it felt handled. Because I had done the thing that looked like action. And I told myself that was enough. James said nothing. The silence that greeted this confession was not hostile. It was something more patient than hostility. The silence of a room that has been waiting for this exact admission and is now simply receiving it. Was it enough? James said finally. Stahl looked directly at the camera. Directly at James. No, James agreed, it was not. I knew about the complaints, Stahl said. Not the full scope of what you've documented. But enough, and I approved a memo. Hope isn't policy, Warren. A memo isn't accountability. And knowing about a problem for 4 months without resolving it is not the same as not knowing. It is something else entirely. It is a choice. Stahl absorbed that. He did not argue with it. He did not qualify it. He sat with it the way Carol had sat with her own version of the same truth. What happens now, Stahl said, is up to you. We'll support whatever the review requires. I know you will, James said. We'll talk about the specifics when I land. He closed the video call. The screen went dark. And the forward cabin of Transamerica Flight 11 War 7 sat in the particular quiet of a space where several people heard the truth plainly and are now working out what to do with the rest of their lives. Merritt sat down, not in the cockpit, in the aisle seat of the row across from James. Seat 1C, facing the window on the other side. He sat the way men sit when they are no longer managing their posture. When the professional infrastructure that usually holds a body upright has been temporarily suspended. I sat there for a while without saying anything. James let him. Outside both windows, just cloud. The plane was in a layer of it. The diffuse gray-white light that comes when you're inside cloud rather than above it. The kind of light that has no direction, and therefore no shadow. Everything flattened, everything ambient. Can I ask you something? Merritt said. Yes. The 9 times. I said 9 premium cabin challenges out of 11 flights in premium cabins. 4 with Transamerica, yes. The other 5, different airlines, 3 different carriers. 2 incidents on one of them. Merritt looked at his hands, turned them over, looked at the backs of them. So it's not just us. No. It's not just Transamerica. But Transamerica appears at a higher rate relative to its size and route volume than any other carrier in the review dataset. Which is why this flight was part of the review. How carriers are in the dataset. 11. Merritt absorbed that. And we're the worst. You have the highest documented rate per revenue mile, yes. He turned his hands back over, looked at his palms. My son, he said. He said it that the way you say the name of something that suddenly appears in a new light and you're not sure the light is something you can look at directly. His name is Marcus. He's 17. He's a brief stop. He's a good person, an actually good person. The kind of kid who notices when his friends are having a hard time, who remembers things, who asks how you're doing and waits for the real answer. James listened. He wants to study environmental science. He's been researching University of Michigan's program since he was 15. He knows more about freshwater conservation's policy than most adults I know. He sounds like someone worth knowing. He is. Merritt paused. Last spring, he was stopped at the entrance of a grocery store, 3 blocks from our house. He'd been going to that store since he was 12. The security guard asked him to open his backpack. James looked at him. He called me from the parking lot. He was. Merritt stopped again. His voice had arrived at the edge of something. He wasn't crying exactly. But he was close. He said, Dad, did I do something wrong? The question sat in the cabin like a stone dropped in still water. What did you tell him? James said. I told him no, that he hadn't done anything wrong. That sometimes security is just cautious, and it's not personal, and the best thing to do is cooperate and not escalate and move on. He looked at the window, at the featureless gray light of the cloud layer. I've been telling him some version of that since he was old enough to go places on his own. Stay calm, don't react, make yourself easy to read, don't give anyone a reason to. He stopped. I've been teaching my son, he said slowly, to make himself smaller than he is. Not because it's right, because I thought it was safer. And this morning, James said, you came into this cabin and asked a 58-year-old man with a valid ticket and valid ID to make himself smaller. Merritt didn't answer. He didn't need to. A connection was sitting there between them, visible and unavoidable. The thing Merritt had been circling since the radio call from Osei, and now had arrived at Fully. He had been giving his son the tools that had kept him safe, and this morning he had been the person those tools were meant to protect Marcus from. The fact that you can see that, James said, matters. It's not absolution, but it matters. It doesn't fix anything. No, but it's where fixing starts. Always, every time. He looked at Merritt directly. The question is what you do with the seeing. Whether you let it change something in how you act going forward, or whether you reorganize around it. Protect yourself from the discomfort of it. Wait for it to fade. Merritt looked at him. I don't want it to fade. Good, James said. Then let it. They sat in the gray-white cloud light for a moment. Two men in their 50s, both with things they were carrying, both with sons, both in their different ways, trying to figure out how to leave the right things behind. Mr. Caldwell, Merritt said, yes. Regional Director Kim from the Office of Civil Rights, she's meeting us when we land? She is. She's been coordinating with my office throughout the review period. She'll facilitate the formal debrief. Merritt nodded slowly. I'll be there, he said, whatever that requires. He stood up, straightened his jacket, walked back to the cockpit. James watched him go, then turned back to the window. The cloud was beginning to break. Below, very far below, the brown and ochre of the southwest was becoming visible. Arizona approaching, the desert landscape that looked from altitude like something ancient and patient and entirely indifferent to whatever small human dramas were occurring above it. He thought about his father, about a transit board meeting, about August heat, about the kitchen table, about the kind of tired that goes past the body, about showing up anyway. He put his hand on the briefcase. 14 months, 26 flights, 61 names, one more to land. Maya Reeves had been sitting in 3C for 2 hours and 40 minutes. She had stopped recording at some point during the video call, not because the situation had resolved, because the recording felt complete, but because she had what she needed, which was not a performance or a confrontation, just a record, just the plain truth of what had happened, existing in documented form, unable to be revised by whoever's version of events happened to be loudest later. She had put the phone in her bag, and then she had sat with what she was carrying, because she was carrying something. Had been carrying it, actually, for 3 years. Since the phone call from her father on a Tuesday afternoon, his voice doing that thing it did, that careful neutrality, that was more alarming than distress would have been. Because her father was not a man who did careful neutrality. He was warm, direct, present. When his voice went flat and measured, it meant something underneath it was not. He had told her what happened in the way people tell you things when they have decided not to make it a big deal. Already organized, already minimized. The story with its own built-in conclusion. It was handled, it's over, it wasn't worth the trouble. She had asked if he was going to file a complaint. He had said the word she had been dreading, no. She had asked why. He had said, because it will be more trouble than it's worth. And I don't want you to grow up thinking the world is always going to be against us. She had been 27 years old enough to understand exactly what had happened and what the decision not to report it meant, young enough to not know what to do with that understanding except hold it. She had held it for 3 years. She stood up now. She walked to the front of the cabin, stopped beside seat 1A. James looked up. She held out her phone, not the recording from this morning. A different, pulled up already, paused on the first frame. This is from 3 years ago, she said. Transamerica, Denver to Boston, seat 14B. James took the phone. He looked at the screen, a first-class cabin, different configuration from this one, but recognizably the same airline's livery on the headrests, the same blue-gray color palette. The video was slightly shaky, shot quickly, from an angle that said it had been recorded by someone sitting down and not sure they should be recording. A man stood in the aisle near the front, 62 years old, maybe, well-dressed in the way of someone whose professional life required it and who had long since stopped thinking about it. The kind of calm on his face that was not natural ease but practiced management. The kind of calm you build over decades of situations that require it. He was gathering his things, not arguing, not resisting. Just gathering his things, placing them in his bag with the deliberate care of someone who has decided that no gesture can be ambiguous right now, and walking back through the curtain. His face, as he turned to go, was arranged into an expression that revealed nothing and therefore revealed everything. James watched till the clip ended. He handed the phone back. "Your father," he said. Not a question. He was going to a cardiology conference in Boston. He'd been asked to present on a panel. I'd been doing this kind of work for 30 years. What happened after? He was rebooked on a connecting route. He arrived in Boston 11 hours late. He presented at 7:30 the next morning on 4 hours of sleep. No. The word landed the same way it always did when James heard it. Not with surprise. With the particular weight of a thing that has been heard 61 times and never quite becomes ordinary. He said it wasn't worth the trouble. Worth the trouble for who? Haya looked at him. Something in the question had sharpened the air between them. For me, she said. He said he didn't want me growing up thinking the world was always going to be against us. He was trying to protect you. Yes, the same way Captain Merritt has been protecting his son. The same way a lot of people protect the people they love. By teaching them to absorb things quietly. Yes. And what does that protection cost? Maya looked at the phone in her hands, at the paused video. Her eyes back, the curtain, the particular way a first-class cabin looks when you are being asked to leave it. It costs them the right to be angry, she said. It costs them the truth of what happened. It teaches them that the appropriate response to being treated as less than you are is to make yourself smaller and keep moving. She looked up. I'm tired of that lesson. I've been tired of it for 3 years. James looked at her for a long moment, really looked. The way he looked at things when he wanted to remember them accurately. Your father thought it wasn't worth the trouble, he said. Yes. I want you to know it was always worth the trouble. For him. For you. For every person in this folder who made the same decision he made. The fact that they chose not to file doesn't mean the thing didn't happen. It means they were carrying it alone. He held the folder. Part of what this review does is say, you don't have to carry it alone. The record can hold it. And the record matters. Even when the person who experienced it decided in the moment that making it a record wasn't safe. Maya stood with that. He'll find out about the video, she said. I'll have to tell him. How do you think he'll respond? He'll worry. He'll wonder why I've been carrying it. He'll say something that sounds like it's about protecting me, but is really about the fact that it still hurts him. She paused. And then eventually he'll be okay with it. Call him when we land. I was going to. Tell him what happened today. Not to upset him. James looked at the folder, then at Maya. Just so he knows that it wasn't nothing. What happened to him 3 years ago? That someone's born paying attention. That it's part of a record now. Maya held the phone against her chest. It was never nothing, James said. Not a single one of the 61 things in here was nothing. They happened in a world that was very practiced at making people feel that way. That's not the same thing. Maya was quiet for a moment. With his permission, she said. If he agrees, can the video be part of the documentation? Yes. No identifying information in the public filing if he prefers. But the incident on the record. The date, the flight, the outcome. He might say yes, she said. He's braver than he usually lets on. Most people are, James said. That's one of the things this work keeps showing me. She looked at him, at the folder, at the briefcase on the floor with its months of accumulated evidence that something real had been happening to real people on real flights, and deserved to be called what it was. Thank you, she said. Thank your father, James said. When you call him. She nodded, walked back to 3C, sat down, looked out the window at the desert below, Arizona spreading out below the plain in all its ancient, indifferent vastness. Brown and rust and ochre and the dark green of things that had learned to survive without much of what they needed. She thought about her father, about the tone of his voice on the phone 3 years ago, about the conference in Boston, about a presentation on freshwater, about cardiology, about 30 years of work and a panel discussion and a man who had arrived 11 hours late on 4 hours of sleep and presented anyway because that was what you did. That was what you did. She picked up her phone. She didn't start a recording. She opened her contacts, found her father's name. She didn't call yet. They were still in the air. But she hovered over the number, let herself feel the weight of the conversation that was coming. Not with dread, with something closer to readiness. Because there were things that needed to be said out loud. Because saying them out loud was the beginning of them being real in a different way than they had been. Because her father had carried something alone for 3 years. and she had carried it with him without telling him. And the both of them carrying it separately in silence was not protection. It was just silence. And silence, a man in seat 1 said this morning, only protects the people doing the harm. Below the window, the desert went on, patient, ancient, already knowing all the things the people above it were just now learning. The plane began its descent. Phoenix, 9:47 in the morning. The desert heat was already committed to itself. Not the tentative warmth of early morning that leaves room for negotiation. The full declaration of an Arizona summer day. The kind that hits you in the 2-second gap between the jet bridge and the terminal air conditioning. That brief, unguarded moment when the real world reminds you it exists outside of climate control and recycled cabin air. The wheels touched down at 9:41. 6 minutes to reach the gate. The plane settled into its parking position with the particular finality of a journey that had been more than its listed duration suggested. Most passengers deplaned the way passengers always do. The overhead bins opening in sequence, the shuffle forward. The collective impatience of people who had been stationary for 2.5 hours and needed to be moving again. The businessman from 2C was on his phone before he reached the jet bridge, talking fast, already 3 conversations ahead of the one he'd been sitting inside for the past hour. The couple from 4A moved quickly, quietly, the specific urgency of people who had a connection to make and knew the math was close. Some of them looked back as they passed seat 1A. Not all of them, but some. The looks were different things. Curiosity. Something that might have been recognition. Something that might have been discomfort that hadn't finished becoming understanding. A few were simply the involuntary glance of people passing something that had mattered and not knowing what to do with that fact while in motion. James sat. He always sat for a few minutes after landing. Not out of habit exactly. More out of respect for the fact that a journey had occurred and deserved a moment of acknowledgement before you picked up your bag and moved on to whatever came next. His father had done the same thing. He'd told James once that the worst thing you could do after going somewhere important was to immediately start acting like you were already somewhere else. The cabin emptied around him. He looked out the window. The Phoenix tarmac in the morning sun. Heat shimmer already visible at the edges of the concrete. Other planes at their gates, the ordinary machinery of an airport operating at its ordinary pace, indifferent to whatever had happened aboard one specific aircraft that morning. He opened his briefcase one final time, not to review anything, not to add anything, just to look at it. The folder, the 61 tabs, the 14 months of work that had begun as a mandate from an office and had become, somewhere along the way, something more personal than that, something he would have done regardless. Something his father would have recognized. He closed the briefcase, stewed, put on his jacket with the same unhurried care with which he did most things, straightened his tie, checked his watch, his father's watch. 9:49 a.m. Phoenix time. Time to go. He picked up the briefcase and walked off the plane. Sandra Kim was waiting at the end of the jet bridge, 50 years old. Natural hair cropped close. A gray blazer that had the look of something worn because it was practical. Not because anyone had told her it was appropriate. A regional director for the Office of Civil Rights, Southwest Division, Department of Transportation. She had been coordinating with James's office for the full 14 months of the review. They had spoken on the phone 37 times. They had met in person twice before today. She did not look particularly surprised by anything as he came through the door. She rarely did. James, a handshake, firm. Flight looked eventful from the outside. It was eventful from the inside, too. The crew is here. Beaumont and Merritt came straight from deplaning. The airline's legal team arrived 40 minutes ago. They were already in Phoenix for an unrelated meeting, which I suspect is less coincidental than it appears. It's not coincidental at all, James said. Warren Stahl is efficient when he wants to be. The room is ready. Second floor, past security. Conference room B, she paused. How are you? James looked at her. Not the automatic assessment of someone who has been asked a polite question. Actually considered it.
Tired, he said. The productive kind. She nodded once, the nod of someone who understood
that distinction completely. Then let's get this done. They walked together through the terminal, past the gate areas, and the coffee shops, and the news kiosks, and the particular population of airports at mid-morning. The business travelers moving with the efficiency of people who have done this 1,000 times. The families navigating the beautiful chaos of going somewhere together. The solo travelers with their headphones and their carefully arranged self-sufficiency. James watched them as he walked. He always did. 14 months of flying had not made airports ordinary to him. They had made them more interesting, more layered. Every gate a small theater. Every waiting area a temporary community assembled by coincidence and schedule. And the logistics of going from one place to another. Every cabin a version of the same story, playing out at different speeds. Sandra, he said as they reached the elevator. Yes, the crew. Before the formal debrief. I'd like a few minutes with them separately before the lawyers are in the room. She looked at him, Beaumont to Memis. She considered this. Not the legal architecture of it, much more. The human architecture. Minutes. I'll keep the lawyers occupied. That's all I'll need. The antechamber outside conference room B was the kind of space that existed in airports to be functional and succeeded at nothing beyond that. 3 chairs against one wall. A small table with a water pitcher that someone had placed there and forgotten. The low hum of the building's ventilation system. A window that looked onto the tarmac, which was at least better than looking at a wall. Carol was sitting in one of the chairs. She had changed out of her uniform. A gray blouse. Dark slacks. Without the navy and gold, she looked not smaller. Present. More herself, in the way that removing a costume reveals the person underneath, which is not always a comfortable revelation for the person being revealed. She's sitting with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the window, and her mind somewhere that was not the antechamber. She looked up when James came in. Merritt was standing. He'd changed too. A blue button-down, open at the collar. Without the captain's stripes, he was just a man in his mid-50s, with silver at his temples, and a particular quality of stillness that had nothing to do with professional composure. The stillness of someone who has been thinking hard for 2 hours and has arrived somewhere he wasn't expecting. James pulled the 3rd chair from the wall and sat down. No table between them, no laptops, no legal pads, no documents. Just 3 people in an anteroom with a water pitcher and a window onto the tarmac, and 10 minutes before the formal part began. The lawyers are next door, James said. We'll go in shortly. But I wanted to talk to you both first. Without the legal infrastructure. Carol looked at him. Merritt looked at him. Neither of them spoke, which was fine, which was correct. This was not a moment that required filling. What happens in that room, James said, is going to involve formal processes. Documentation, statements, HR review. The legal team laying out the airline's position and obligations. That's the structure. It's necessary. It does what structures do. He looked at his hands for a moment. But structures don't change people. People change people. Or they change themselves. And what I want to say to you before we go in there is separate from any of that. Harold's hands moved in her lap. A small adjustment. More like settling. Miss Beaumont, James said. 12 years. 4 documented incidents before today. You've been doing this job well by most external measures. You show up. You know the manual. You care about the passengers in the abstract. I don't doubt that. He looked at her directly. But caring in the abstract and seeing clearly in the specific are not the same thing. And this morning, in the specific, you looked at a man in a seat he had paid for, and you told your captain that he didn't belong. Not because of his ticket. Not because of his behavior. Because of the way he looked. Carol didn't look away. I know, she said. I need you to understand something about that moment. It wasn't a random error. It wasn't a bad day. It was the 5th time. And in that context, the question isn't whether you made a mistake. The question is what you are made of underneath the mistake. She looked at him. What do you mean? I mean, some people, when they see themselves clearly for the first time, spend the rest of their lives arguing with the mirror. Finding reasons the reflection is wrong. Finding the version of the story where they are not the person they just saw themselves being. I paused, and some people look at the mirror and say, that's me, that's what I've been doing, and then they figure out what to do with that. Carol was very still. Which one are you? James said. A long moment. I don't know yet, she said. I think I want to be the second one. I think I'm going to need time to find out if that's actually true. That, James said, is an honest answer. It's the right answer. He turned to Merritt. Captain, 23 years. The numbers in the briefcase are real. The pattern is real. But I'm not here to tell you you're a bad person. I've done this work long enough to know that the question of whether someone is a good person is not the most useful question in this context. Merritt looked at him steadily. The useful question is, what do you do with what you know now? Because you know things now that you didn't know this morning. You know what your authorization patterns look like from the outside. You know what your son experiences when the world reads him the way you read me. You know what it looks like when the thing you taught yourself to call professional judgment is actually something else. Merritt's jaw tightened, not defensively. The tightening of someone holding something that is heavier than they expected. Yes, he said. I know those things. What are you going to do with them? Merritt looked at the window, at the tarmac, at a plane pushing back from a distant gate, the small tractor nudging it backward into position, the deliberate, patient work of getting something enormous moving in the right direction. I want to do the work, he said. Whatever comes out of that room next door, the formal process, the review, whatever the airline requires, I want to do it, and I want to do more than what's required. What does more look like? I want to tell this story, not the version where I'm the villain and you're the hero, the true version, where I'm a person who has been doing something harmful without understanding it was harmful, and then understood it, and then had to decide what to do next. He looked at James. I want my son to hear me tell that story, in public.
I want him to see his father be honest about something difficult instead of teaching him to manage difficult things by minimizing them. Something in James's face shifted, the small, real shift of a man receiving something that lands.
That, he said quietly, is exactly the kind of thing that makes this work worth doing. He looked at both of them. There's going to be a proposal in the room next door, a framework. Part of it involves field educator positions, current employees who are willing to travel to Transamerica hubs and tell the truth about what happened. Not a performance, not a PR initiative. The actual story in actual rooms to the actual people who do this work every day. Carol looked up. Us, she said. Anyone willing. It's voluntary. The compensation stays the same. The work changes completely. It's hard work. It requires you to stand in front of people who may not want to hear what you have to say and say it anyway. It requires you to tell a story that doesn't make you look good for most of its length. He looked at Carol, at Merritt, but it's real work, hot performance, and the people in those rooms will know the difference.
Carol looked at her hands, then at the window, then at James.
I'll do it, she said.
No deliberation, no conditions, just
yes.
The way Sophie laughed, full and unedited. Merritt nodded, once slow.
So will I, he said, and I want to bring Marcus to one of them. I want him in the room. James looked at him. How old did you say he is? 17. Old enough to understand what he's watching. Yes, that's exactly why. James stood, picked up his briefcase, looked at them both one more time. Not with warmth exactly, with something more precise than warmth. With the particular regard of a person who spent a long time watching people and has just seen two of them choose something that most people in their position would not choose. Let's go in, he said. The room seated 8 comfortably. A table, chairs, a whiteboard with the ghost of a previous meeting's contents still faintly visible beneath the surface, no matter how many times it had been erased. A screen at one end for the video connection to headquarters. A window that looked out onto the terminal's interior. The movement of travelers visible through the glass like a silent film, playing on the other side of the world. James sat on one side of the table, Carol and Merritt beside him, which was not the arrangement the airline's lawyers had expected, but which none of them addressed directly. Sandra Kim sat at the end, legal pad in front of her, pen uncapped. 2 airline lawyers at the far end, laptops open. One of them was already typing. The screen lit up. Warren Stahl. Margaret O.C. The same conference room in headquarters, the same fluorescent light. But the atmosphere had changed since the video call on the plane. Something had settled in Stahl's face. The agitation of early morning, the calculating quality of a man managing an unfolding crisis, had been replaced by something more deliberate. The look of a man who had made decisions and was now simply in them. We're ready on our end, O.C. said. Good, James said. Let's begin. The senior lawyer at the far end of the table spoke first. Her name was Patricia Holt. She was good. Efficient in the way of someone who had spent her career navigating the intersection of corporate liability and human behavior, and had learned to move through it with precision. She laid out the airline's preliminary position in 4 minutes, acknowledged the incident, acknowledged the crew's conduct, noted the company's existing diversity and inclusion framework, proposed an enhanced training cycle, a formal apology to the affected passenger, and a private settlement offer to resolve the matter expediently. She finished, looked at James. James looked at Sandra Kim. Kim turned a page on her legal pad.
Miss Holt, James said, how many times has Transamerica Airlines issued a press release announcing enhanced diversity and inclusion training in response to a discrimination incident or complaint?
Holt paused, briefly. I don't have that number in front of me. James opened his briefcase, pulled out a thin folder, set it in the center of the table. 6 times, he said. In the past 4 years. I have all press releases here.
The language across them is in places nearly identical. The intervals between them suggest that each new announcement was prompted by a new incident, rather than implemented as a result of the previous one.
He left the folder in the center of the table. A training cycle is not a framework. An apology to one passenger does not address 61 documented incidents. And a private settlement resolves the legal exposure for one interaction while leaving the pattern that produced it entirely intact. Holt looked at the folder, then at James.
What enters?
James reached into the briefcase, pulled out the document he had been building for the last 3 months of the review. 94 pages. Tab. The cover page bearing the seal of the Department of Transportation's Office of Civil Rights, and the words in independent review findings. Final report in plain block letters. Placed 1 copy in front of Sandra Kim, 1 in front of Holt, 1 he kept. This goes to the Department of Transportation as a public filing within 48 hours, he said. That is not a negotiating position. That is the structure of the review. The report is public because the problem is public. The 61 people in this documentation deserve a public record, not a private settlement that requires them to stay silent in exchange for compensation. Holt looked at Stahl on the screen. Stahl looked at the report cover. Then he looked at James. What goes alongside it? You said in the call on the plane that there's a difference between being accountable and being reactive. What does accountability look like here? James had been waiting for that question, not because it was unexpected, because it was the question that made the rest of the conversation possible, the question that meant Stahl had moved from managing the incident to addressing it. 3 things, James said. A compliance framework, not a training program. Measurable outcomes. Third-party auditing every 6 months. Passenger complaint data made public on a quarterly basis, disaggregated by route and crew. Clear disciplinary standards that apply at every level of the organization without exception. He looked at Stahl directly. Number 2, the Field Educator Program. 2 positions to start, expanding as the program develops. Current employees, voluntary, who understand what went wrong because they were part of it, who can speak to other crews with the authority of personal experience rather than the distance of a training video. He glanced at Carol, at Merritt, briefly, not pointing, just acknowledging. And number 3, he said, a direct communication from your office, Warren, to every employee in the company, not a corporate memo about values. A personal account of what happened on this flight, what the crew did, what the pattern behind it looks like, what the company failed to do when it received the preliminary summary 4 months ago, and what you are committing to do differently. The room was very quiet. Holt was typing, steadily, the sound of someone capturing things they know matter. Stahl sat with James's words for a moment. Not long. He was not a man who required long. He had made his decision somewhere between the early morning phone call and the video call on the plane. He was now simply executing it. The public filing, he said. It triggers a congressional hearing. Yes. That could be significant for the company. Yes. It will also be significant for 61 passengers who were told, in various ways, on various flights, that they did not belong where they had paid to be, and for the many more who experienced the same thing and said nothing because they had decided it wasn't worth the trouble. Stahl looked at the report. I know that. A pause. We'll do all 3, he said. The framework, the educators, the communication, and we'll cooperate fully with the department's process. He looked directly at the camera. James, I want it on the record, this is the company's choice. Not legal obligation, not crisis management. Choice. Sandra Kim wrote something on her legal pad. Noted, she said. The tension in the room, not resolved exactly, but transitioned, the way storms transition. Not into calm exactly. Unto the particular quality of air that follows when something significant has passed through, and the work of clearing up begins. Holt looked at Carol, at Merritt. There will be formal HR processes, she said. Her voice had changed. The precise legal instrument of it had given way to something more human. Reviews, interviews. The outcome depends on those processes and what they find. We'll understand, Carol said. The field educator positions, those are contingent on the outcome of the review. I understand, Merritt said, but the offer stands, and it will be considered favorably. She looked at James. Anything else before we close? One thing, James said. He looked at Stahl on the screen, the preliminary summary you received 4 months ago, the memo you approved. I want those included in the public record. Holt started to say something. Stahl raised one hand slightly. She stopped. Yes, he said. Include them. The lawyer looked at her laptop screen, typed something, stopped typing. Looked at Stahl, Warren. That's include them, he said again. If we're going to do this, we do it completely. The record of what we knew and when we knew it is part of the story. Leaving it out would just be a different kind of the same frame problem. He looked at James. You said hope isn't policy, and you're right. But I'd like to try something different. Actual accountability. On the record, even when it's uncomfortable. James looked at him for a long moment. Then we have an agreement, he said. The meeting ended at 11:21. The lawyers gathered their laptops. Sandra Kim exchanged a few quiet words with Holt about filing timelines. Stahl and O.C. signed off the video call. Merritt shook hands with James and with Kim, and walked toward the terminal with the particular straightness of someone carrying something heavy and doing it consciously rather than unconsciously, which is a different thing entirely. Carol was the last to leave the conference room. She stopped at the door. Mr. Caldwell. James looked up from the table where he was replacing the report by his briefcase. If I do this, the field educator work. Stand in front of rooms and tell them what I did. Honestly, without softening it. She paused. Does it actually change anything? Or does it become, I don't know, a routine? A thing you do often enough that it stops meaning what it meant the first time? James thought about that, really thought about it. Not the fast answer, the true one. I think it depends on whether you let Sophie's face be in the room with you every time you tell it. Carol looked at him. What do you mean? I mean, the story you're going to tell is about more than what happened on this flight. It's about what you want your daughter to inherit from you. What you want the world to look like for her when she's standing where you're standing. If you keep that in the room with you, if you don't let the telling of it become separate from the reason for it, then it won't become a routine. He looked at her steadily. If you do let it become separate, then yes, it becomes a routine. And a routine is just another way of going through motions that have stopped meaning anything. Carol stood with that for a moment. Sophie has the loudest laugh, she said. Not to him exactly. To the room, to the air. She doesn't edit herself. She just is. Whatever she's feeling it completely. That's what you're working toward, James said. A world that doesn't ask her to edit that. That doesn't look at her and decide, before she opens her mouth, whether she belongs. Carol nodded. She opened the door, stopped one more time, not looking back, just stopped in the doorway with the terminal noise coming through from the other side. Thank you, she said. Go call Sophie, James said. She almost laughed. Not quite, but close. She went. James stood alone in conference room B for a moment. The table with its water rings. The whiteboard with its ghost of previous meetings. The window onto the terminal where Carol was already visible, walking toward the gate areas, phone in hand, pulling up a contact. He watched until she turned corner to corner and was gone. Then he picked up his briefcase. He was almost at the door when Merritt appeared. Not from the direction of the gates. From the opposite end of the corridor. Had something in his hand. A folded piece of paper, old by the look of it, the fold lines gone soft with age, the edges worn at the corners. I was looking for you, Merritt said. I'm here. Merritt held out the paper. James took it, looked at it, looked at Merritt. Before we landed, Merritt said, Maya came forward. She'd been on her phone during the descent. She found something. He paused. She said she'd been researching since she recognized your name on the manifest. She thought you should have it. James looked at the paper in his hand, folded 4 times. The folds precise which told something about the person who had made them. What is it? A letter. Your father wrote it. The night of his transit board testimony. September 1989. It's in a public archive, part of a civil rights documentation project out of a university library. Someone digitized it years ago. Maya found the scan. James stood very still, not with shock. Something quieter than shock. The stillness of a person who has just been handed something they did not know existed and is taking a moment before opening it to acknowledge that the moment matters. He unfolded it, slowly, along the original folds which were his father's folds, which made the unfolding feel like something more than opening a piece of paper. The handwriting was his father's. He recognized it immediately. The way you recognize a voice you haven't heard in years, not gradually, not with effort, but all at once. Recognition landing before the processing. His father's hand, 1989, on the letterhead of the Birmingham Municipal Transit Authority. But below the printed header, in the space that was meant for official correspondence, his father had written something personal, as if the stationery had been the nearest paper, and the writing had been too urgent to wait for something more appropriate. James read, "To whoever needs to hear this, I testified tonight. 3 hours in a hallway first, which is its own kind of message. Then 40 minutes in a room with 9 people, most of whom had already decided what they thought before I opened my mouth. I said what I came to say. I don't know if it changed anything. I don't know if I'll be around to see whether it changed anything. But I know this, and I'm writing it down because I want it to exist somewhere outside my own head. Staying quiet is not the same as staying safe. I have been quiet many times in my life, in rooms that did not want my voice, in situations where speaking would have cost more than I could afford. I was quiet in the name of protection, for myself, for my family, for the son I'm trying to raise into a world that is going to require him to be twice as good and half as loud as anyone who looks different from him. But quiet doesn't make the thing that should not be happening stop happening. Quiet only makes it easier for the thing to continue. Quiet protects the people doing the harm. I don't know if James will read this. I'm writing it to him, and I'm writing it to no one, and I'm writing it to everyone who will ever stand in a hallway for 3 hours before being allowed into a room where decisions of their lives are made. You are not wrong to be tired. You are not wrong to wonder if it matters. But staying quiet is not the answer. The answer is to go in anyway, to say the thing anyway, to stand in the room and make the record. The record matters, even when we can't see what it grows into. Robert Caldwell, September 14, 1989. James read it twice. Standing in the doorway of Conference Room B in the Phoenix airport, holding a piece of paper that had been written 35 years ago at a kitchen table in Birmingham by a man who had spent 3 hours in a hallway and come home tired and written into the night because the writing was the only place left to put it. He read it twice and then he stood there, just stood there, not composing himself, not managing anything, just being a 58-year-old man holding his father's handwriting and feeling the full weight of it, the full, unhurried, undefended weight. Merritt was still there, had not left, had understood correctly that this was not a moment to fill with anything. After a while, James looked up. He never knew if it mattered, he said. Merritt looked at him. No, he said. I don't think he did. He wrote that he didn't know if I would ever read this. I know. James looked at the letter he was writing to me and to everyone at the same time. That's what it sounds like, Merritt said quietly. James folded the letter, carefully, along the original folds, his father's folds. The same width, the same sequence, the paper going back to the shape it had held for 35 years. Creased by Robert Caldwell's hands in a kitchen in Birmingham on a September night when the work had felt uncertain and the tiredness was in the bones, and he had picked up a pen anyway. James put it in his inside jacket pocket, against his chest, next to the note card he had carried for 30 years. The one he had written at 23, sitting across the table from his father, trying to capture something before it left the room. Both of them there now, father and son. 35 years of the same lesson carried in different forms. He looked at Merritt. Tell Maya. He stopped. Tell her thank you. She said to tell you, you're welcome, and that she's going to call her father when she lands. Good, James said and extended his hand. James shook it, a real handshake. The kind where both people mean it and know the other one means it. Captain, James said. Mr. Caldwell. They looked at each other for a moment. 2 men who had started this morning as adversaries in a small drama about a seat assignment and had ended it somewhere neither of them had expected to be. Merritt turned and walked toward the gate areas. James watched him go. Then he walked the other way, through the terminal, past the coffee shops and the news kiosks and the families and the business travelers and the ordinary, beautiful chaos of people going places. He walked slowly, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to feel the movement of the place around him, the aliveness of it. All these people with their destinations and their histories and their things they were carrying that nobody else could see. He found the exit, walked out, into the Phoenix heat. The full declaration of it, immediate and total, the desert summer landing on him the moment the automatic doors parted. He stood on the curb for a moment and let it hit him. The heat and the light and the smell of asphalt and jet fuel and the particular sharpness of desert air that has nothing damp in it to soften anything. Found a bench, concrete, partially shaded by the overhang of the terminal roof. He sat down, set the briefcase beside him, looked at the cars and shuttles and taxis moving through the pickup, at a family loading luggage into an SUV, the father hoisting a bag into the back, while a child sat on top of the remaining luggage like it was a throne, at a shuttle pulling up, doors opening, people filing in with the organized patience of people who have done this before and know what it requires. He put his hand in his jacket pocket, felt the folded letter, the note card behind it. He sat with both of them for a moment, not reading them, just knowing they were there. Then he took out his phone, called. 1 ring, 2. James, his mother's voice, 79 years old, sharp and unhurried, the same as it had always been. The voice of a woman who had seen a great many things and had organized them all into a working understanding of the world that she was not, at this point, planning to revise. Hi, Mom. How was the flight? Complicated. They always are with you. A pause, not impatient. The pause of someone who knows when more is coming and is simply making room for it. What kind of complicated? The kind where things that needed to happen finally happened. I found something today. From Dad. The quality of her silence changed, a very small change. Something shifted in the texture of it, the way the air shifts when a door opens somewhere in a house and you feel the change in pressure before you see any movement. What did you find? A letter. He wrote it the night of the transit board testimony, September 1989. A breath. Slow. Oh, she said. The word small, but not simple. 35 years of knowing a man. 30 years of knowing the letter existed somewhere in the form of a memory of a night when he came home tired and sat at the table and wrote. The word carried all of that. Did you know about it? James said. I knew he wrote. I went to sleep, and when I woke in the night, he was still at the table. I didn't ask what it was. It seemed like something he needed to do alone. He wrote it to me, James said, among other people, but to me. She was quiet for a moment. What did he say? He said staying quiet only protects the people doing the harm. His mother made a small sound. Not a laugh, not a cry, something in between. The sound of someone hearing a sentence they recognize completely, have always recognized, from a voice they carry everywhere. He used to say that to me, she said, when things were hard, when I wanted to let something go because the letting go was easier than the fighting. He would say, Ruth, quiet only protects the wrong people. He said it like it was simple. Was it simple? Nothing was simple with your father. He just made it sound that way. A pause. I never knew if the testimony changed anything. He asked me once, years later, whether I thought it had mattered. I told him I didn't know, which was the truth. James looked at the sky above the terminal. The Arizona blue, absolute and declarative, the kind of blue that makes no apologies for what it is. It mattered, he said. You're sitting in Phoenix. I'm sitting in Phoenix. And you did something today. Yes. Something that needed doing. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Not empty quiet, the kind that contains things. Did you stay quiet? She asked. James looked at the letter in his pocket, at the watch on his wrist, at the briefcase beside him, with its 94 pages. Going to Washington in 48 hours. Going into the public record. Going into the world where records go, when someone decides they matter enough to make them permanent. No, he said. I didn't stay quiet. The line small. Barely there. The sound of something releasing that had been held in place for a long time. Good, his mother said. Your father would be proud. James sat with that, the heat, the light, the cars moving through the lanes, a shuttle pulling away. A child pressing her face against the shuttle window, looking out at the world with the full, undivided attention of someone for whom everything is still new. She looked at James. He raised his hand. She waved back, full arm, no ambiguity about it. The wave of someone who has not yet learned to make herself smaller. The shuttle pulled away. James sat on the bench a little while longer, not doing anything, not managing anything, not reviewing or planning or documenting. Just being a man sitting in the Phoenix sun with his father's letter against his chest and his father's watch on his wrist and the scratch of the desert heat on his face and the knowledge, not comfortable knowledge, not triumphant knowledge, but the solid, weight-bearing kind, that the day had been what it needed to be, that the record existed now, that 61 names had a document, that Carol Beaumont was somewhere in the terminal calling her daughter, that Douglas Merritt was walking toward his gate, thinking about a 17-year-old boy who wanted to study freshwater conservation and deserved to grow up in a world that read him as exactly who he was, that Maya Reeves was going to call her father, that Warren Stahl had said, include it all, even the parts that make us look like what we were, that the report was going to Washington, that some things take a long time to say out loud, but they are always worth saying. His father had known that, had written it into a letter at a kitchen table at midnight in 1989 and trusted it to the archive, and the archive had trusted it to a woman in seat 3C who had been paying attention. The record mattered, even when you couldn't see what it grew into. James stood up, picked up the briefcase, looked at the Arizona sky one more time, the absolute uncompromising blue of it. Then he walked toward wherever came next.